the metaphor of this, extremely secure border between the present and the past was something that spoke to me, I suppose, as I have sometimes resisted thinking too much about the past for fear that it would emotionally capsize me.
I'm Michael Tamlin. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is Scott Alexander Howard, author of the novel The Other Valley. It's the story of Odile Ozanne, a young girl who lives in a small village in a valley. In the next valley over, there's an identical village where events from 20 years ago are taking place. And the valley to the east, there's another village where it's 20 years in the future. Occasionally, and under the strictest controls, and in a disguise rendering them unidentifiable, people will visit the other valleys, looking forward or backward in time. One day, visitors from the east, that is from the future, are recognized by Odile, and she has to carry on pretending she hasn't seen what she knows she saw. Scott Alexander Howard, welcome to Kobo.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
First of all, can you confirm that I have the geography correct? East to the future and west to the past.
Yes, I've always kind of been waiting for people to get it wrong more than they do. Um, and I confess that occasionally when I dip back into doing interviews, I'll check myself. Like, I do remember my premise, don't I? Yes, I do.
What inspired this device of adjacent valleys across time?
The idea came in one of those just lightning strike images. There wasn't a ton of prior conceptualization as to like, oh, I want to build a time travel story, but do it in a different way. I was sitting at my table and I just had this image of an endlessly repeating chain of towns that were all separated by different intervals of time, but a precise interval. I think at first it was 5 years, and then I expanded it to 20. Um, in terms of like wider emotional inspiration, in the time that's passed since having that idea, I've come to recognize, maybe a little bit more deeply where it came from. What I was doing at my table when I had that idea was helping to try to arrange for final visits for a friend of mine who was in hospice at the time.
Mhm.
And the premise wasn't just that there was these repeating towns. The premise was also, in that first instance, um, that you could go from one town to the other if you were grieving, and you could visit a version of the past town where your lost loved one was still alive, because there it's 20 years ago and they're presumably still healthy and going about their day. And that idea I've since kind of recognized was directly inspired by, this process of kind of pre-grieving my friend and then grieving her when she passed. So I think that's kind of the wider picture of where the idea came from. But again, it was just one of those like, spontaneous images at the time.
And to personalize this a little bit, can you tell us about Odile, the main character that we meet in the story? You know, when in her life do we meet her, and what is she grappling with when we're first introduced to her?
Odile is someone who is very shy, very awkward. We first meet her when she's doing what she regularly does, which is not explore. It's like a before school or a recess. She's just standing by the cloakroom door. Not, she has no friends. She's somewhat a severe cast of mind. She's got a spiky personality. Um, so she's a bit of an outcast when we meet her, and no one really pays her much mind. She's just sort of known as that girl who stands by the door, not talking to others. The time of her life when we meet her, she is with the rest of her class entering what's called the apprenticeship year at her school, which means that everyone's having to kind of pick their careers, pick their vocations. They're applying for apprenticeships around their small town, and she's under immense pressure from her mother to join the kind of municipal governing body called the Conseil. And what the Conseil is kind of the yeah, it's basically City Hall, and it determines who can actually make these trips back and forward in time. You become a kind of a conseiller, a judge whose job it is to rule on people's petitions as to whether they can, whether they're a good candidate to go back into the past or go into the future or not. And Odile herself doesn't want to do this. She's too quiet for the job. She's too shy. She thinks it's too much responsibility. She doesn't really believe that people should go back and forth in time at all. And so she's kind of, yeah, she's somebody who's under a lot of pressure right now, and she's a little bit lost as to what she wants to do. And then this strange foreknowledge just sort of drops into her lap and changes the course of her life.
There seems to be there's a common theme that comes up in a lot of books that are looking at speculative fiction or alternate realities where we're meeting people just as they are making these big choices. What does writing about someone at this age open up for you that maybe you wouldn't be able to engage with if this person was an adult or conversely, much younger?
Well, that's an interesting way of putting the question because in some ways, her at 16 mirrors something that I was going through when I was 36 and writing the story. So I don't
Mm.
know if it's
Hmm.
actually as restricted to adolescence.
Sure.
In my case, anyway, maybe I just have arrested development. Um, but for me, I mentioned that the story was sort of born out of grief, and the story of the novel, I think, is, yeah, it's about grief, but it's also about the things that grief makes us do and how it can sort of change our life path. And in my life, what was happening at that time was that I had been an academic. I was an analytic philosopher at U of T. And I was getting a little bit tired of what I was doing. I was finding, like, first of all, it's very hard to kind of get stable work in that field. So I was starting to question whether it was viable. There was
Hmm.
kind of a material crisis. But there was also kind of a creative or, for lack of a better word, spiritual crisis where I did not think it was really where I belonged. The kind of thing I was interested in doing was much more narrative. I should have been writing novels maybe a
Hmm.
few years earlier than I started to. Um, and once I started to lose my friends, people who were my age, um, it really shook me up. And I thought, like, I don't have time to continue doing something I don't want to do. So I was very much at a crossroads at that time in my life, just as Odile is at 16, where she's got two
Yeah.
very different life paths she could choose between, and the stakes are very high. I think in some ways the device in the fictional world where she has to make a choice that is irrevocable. You're supposed to sort of choose your path in this world and you stick with it. You don't get to, hop from career to career. Um, I think that was reflective of my sense of just how much time it takes to actually choose, a different life course. I had been so invested in academia. I'd been doing
Hmm.
it for almost 20 years at that point and thinking about like, oh God, can I really get out of it now? Can I really start something afresh at this age? So I think that's maybe why I made Odile's choice so stark, is because I was feeling that kind of pressure and the irrevocability too.
Well, then I wonder if that's one of the reasons why we have so many stories that focus in on these fork in the road moments that even though, we may be the story may be about someone 12 or 16 or coming of age or whatever, they reflect these choices that we end up getting confronted with at all ages of life, and makes it
Mhm.
that much more universal. Um, the because it certainly hit that way for me as I was reading this. Time travel seems to be one of those plot devices where authors fall on a spectrum. At one end, we have the ones who have meticulously figured out the rules of causality and timelines and what happens if you keep your parents from meeting in the past. People, authors who love the clockwork of it for its own sake. And then at the other end, you have the authors who just go for it. Don't try to explain it, experience it. Their characters are experiencing it, but they don't try to build up a framework for it. And where would you say you fall on that spectrum?
I guess I could talk about time travel, the genre, all day. I think that I would kind of parse out there's understanding the rules of the world and kind of making your own fictional time travel rules, some of which are just inherited from the genre, some of them are just logical. There's One can understand, like clockwork, all of the ways that it actually works, but then in the telling of the story, you might hold a lot of that back.
Hmm.
So there's kind of those two different layers. There's the fictional metaphysics of time travel, and then there's the stylistic, the way you actually want to tell your story, and where how much the narrative itself is going to delve into into the plumbing. Um, I think that in terms of working it all out, I fall on the clockwork side. In terms of the narrative telling, I fall on the much more impressionistic side. So I don't want, so if you're listening to this and you haven't, read this book, it's a really a book that keeps a lot of the time travel perplexities under the hood. And I tell as much as I need to tell in order to get the story going, but I don't go into a lot of it for its own sake. I was inspired by the kind of speculative fiction that you see in something like Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro.
Hmm.
It's a very light touch, it's a first person narrative, and his narrator only says a little bit about her world, just takes it for granted. That's a similar kind of voice here. I was pretty inspired by that. I call it gestural world building, where the narrator's just like, oh, well, there's this, and you're left to infer what the meaning of that is, rather than very top-down world building that says, here are all the rules of this world. Here's a fictional, history book that explains it even more. It's not that kind of novel. It's something that's very much grounded in the first person narration, and we just get glimpses of what her world is and why it is the way that it is.
And it's tricky to talk about uh, this book for those who haven't read it because it really does reveal itself in pieces. But um, just to give people kind of a flavor for it, you know, talk a bit about how the people in this village view the future and the past that are to the east and the west. How are they sitting in this environment?
Yeah, well, I think one of the ways in which this book, I mean, differs a little bit from other time travel stories. I think that time travel is usually treated as a furtive, secretive device. If you think about the time travel stories that come to mind, like Back to the Future, it's like one mad scientist has this invention and nobody else knows about it. Or it's a secret government agency that has it, something like in Sea of Tranquility or Ministry of Time. It's usually the purview of some kind of like there's one entity or one person and nobody else knows that it exists.
Hmm.
And in the other valley, it is simply a fact of their geography. And so everybody knows. It's public knowledge. It's universally acknowledged that this is their situation. People in the town have very different levels of understanding, but everybody knows that the past is there and the future is there and that it goes on presumably forever in both directions. Even though they can't reach those things normally because there are these, heavily secured borders between all these valleys to prevent meddling in the timeline, essentially. Um, I had a fun time creating a diversity of opinion within the town of their situation. So some people are very irreverent about it. Some people think like, I wish these fences would just come down and we can all just run free. And I really dislike the security state that exists that keeps things orderly. They are libertarian minded and would rather they have more freedom. There are other people who are extremely paranoid and very protective of the way that their lives are, and they are fearful of somebody monkeying around in the past and changing the way that their lives are, affecting their valley in some way. So they're very strongly in favor of the security state. So I think that that's one of those things that I think is reflective of the real world, that it's good to bring into speculative fiction, not a sort of uniformity of opinion that everybody just believes one thing, but that everybody would actually have different views of their situation in these circumstances.
And so there's you as a lover of time travel fiction, but then there's also you as a philosopher. Was this giving you a palette in which you could work through some ideas of how people would work in this environment?
Yeah, I mean, my work in philosophy was all about the emotions. My focus was on specifically emotions to do with the passage of time and our thoughts about
Mm.
time. So it was already it was already pretty touchy-feely as far as philosophy goes. And so sometimes I'll be asked to talk about like, well, how does your philosophy influence your novel writing? And I always think, well, it wasn't a very big leap to go from one to the other. And I don't think that whatever philosophical um, content the book has or whatever influences that it bears from philosophy they're not really the dry stuff, because that's not what I was doing in philosophy. I was working on Virginia Woolf and Proust, and there's haiku poems in my dissertation.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I think a lot of that flowed pretty fluidly into what I was doing here. I think there's a lot of nostalgia in my philosophical work. I was dealing with nostalgia as an attitude, and I think that influence it finds its way into the other valley a lot. There's kind of this general sense of um, I don't know, it's a sort of poignancy and a longing that has kind of I don't know, it's just this atmosphere, this ambiance of preoccupation with the past that exists, especially for Odile. She's somebody who lost her father at a young age. She's somebody who comes to believe she's about to lose one of her only friends at a young age. So the past haunts her, and I think that that's maybe an inheritance from that interest that I have, and from a philosophical background.
The society of these valleys seem to dedicate a lot of resources to controlling the passage between these points in time and space. The borders themselves are controlled. There's a lot of regulation, and Odile, as you said, is training to be one of the conseils, part of that apparatus, the officials that who manage these passages. And there are guards who are authorized to use lethal force to preserve that order if necessary. So why was it important to include this theme of like boundaries and enforcement in a book that is otherwise concerned with things like grief and the choices that we make?
Yeah, I guess there's sort of two answers to that. I think on the level of just world building, storycraft, plot, it struck me that it was realistic in their circumstances that such a society would arise. Um, the consequences of changing the past in this world, as in many time travel stories, means that your present would be radically altered, if not completely undone and revised, replaced by a different present. And knowing that, um, the society decides to erect fences and have heavily militarized borders to prevent that from happening, to keep their lives the way that they know them to be, rather than being, blinked out of existence and replaced.
Mhm.
And I do think that that is the most plausible reaction that human beings would have to to facing those circumstances, on just the level of story. On another level, the reason why there is, I think, this theme of regulation and security and so forth, I think that I was interested in exploring and thematizing our own resistance to delving too much into our own pasts. And so I think that
Mhm.
the metaphor of this, extremely secure border between the present and the past, for example, was something that spoke to me, I suppose, as I have sometimes resisted thinking too much about the past for fear that it would emotionally capsize me. So I think that that's kind of on another reason, another inheritance, I suppose, for why this happens in the book.
In order for someone to cross the border, they have to make a petition. They have to request passage, essentially. And Odile learns in her training that a lot of being a conseil is hearing petitions for travel to the past and being able to reject them tactfully. So, in order to be successful, what does a good request within this village need to include to allow someone to go back or forward?
The Conseil's primary concern is to balance the subjective, private needs of the individual emotionally with the safety of everyone else. And given that there are extreme consequences to somebody interfering in the past or going to the future and sharing information, rather acquiring information and bringing it back. Most of what the Conseil is doing is trying to say, is this person going to be a risk if they leave? Are they going
Mm.
to meddle? Are they going to try to escape their chaperone? Because they're under armed guard the whole time that this happens. And so people whose circumstances are such that they would be likelier to try to interfere in the past. So, for example, somebody who, this is a case in the first half of the novel, Odile has to consider as part of her training for the Conseil whether or not to allow a hypothetical petition from someone whose son was murdered by his own brother. And the students who are considering this case in kind of a law school way, like, should we allow this petition or not? Should we allow him to go back and see his son or not? They have to consider, well, would this man be able to resist taking a run at his brother before he kills his son?
Hmm.
Is this too much of a security risk, even though we all recognize that the pathos of his situation are extreme and that he really, on an emotional level, deserves to be able to see his son again. Um, so these are the kinds of questions that they consider as they're training for the Conseil.
I've read that the Neapolitan novels of Elena Ferrante were an influence on this book. What was it about those novels that resonated with you as you were constructing The Other Valley?
Those are just fantastic novels.
They really are.
What she does with the voice is it's just so magical because it's so unfussy. It's so just crisp and frank
Hmm.
and direct. And I think that that was really eye-opening to me, especially because I read a lot of narrators who are more unreliable or more gnomic. And it's not to say that Lenu is a perfectly reliable narrator, but I'd say that more often she wears her contradictions on her sleeve. You know, she's open about her different and sometimes contrasting attitudes. And I think that was really inspiring to me. I think that also the elevation of this one neighborhood in Naples to a kind of mythic place was also something that I wanted to borrow a little bit. And it's, not just from those novels, but the neighborhood where Odile grows up, and also her town in general. It's a very small place, but it's sort of raised to a kind of mythic proportions in a way because of its insularity. And I've always liked books that do that. I think that Housekeeping, Marilyn Robinson's first novel, also does that. Just this small town of Fingerbone, Idaho, becomes, in my mind, it just became this kind of like mythical zone as well, partly because it's so kind of tucked away in the mountains.
And in both that novel and in The Other Valley, like the village really is the world.
Mhm.
Everything you know and every relationship you have is in there.
Yes.
Tell me a bit more about the path for you to this first novel. As you say, you were working as an academic, you'd built that into a career. Was the desire to also work in fiction, was that something that was just running along, just below the surface, or was there a shift that took place?
Yeah, I think that fiction was really the first love, and academia was the plan B. I was writing, very long short stories. In the seventh grade, I had an English teacher who really, or not an English teacher, he was just my teacher, but he really emphasized creative writing more than anything else. It was more or less a creative writing workshop for the whole grade. And every month we'd have a new short story, and every month he would read mine to the whole class and be like, "This is how you do a short story."
Positive reinforcement for the win.
It was, yeah, and I've promptly abused the privilege by writing a very transparent satire of my entire class, and got pushed up against the wall for it. My first bad review. Um, so I've since stopped writing about anybody that I know.
Always a wise move. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and then I think after that, I started to think, well, this is not a realistic career path. I just got it in my head that you couldn't pursue it. And so I thought rather foolishly, as the world turned out, that university teaching would be a much more secure path. And, learned that the hard way.
Well, I appreciate that your fallback to safety from novelist was philosopher. Like that's a
Yeah. You got to do what you can with what you've got, I
yeah,
think.
yeah.
It was never going to be something more practical. And so yeah, I think that I was always kind of intending to go back to fiction in some way. I didn't know if it would be writing novels. I didn't know if it would be writing screenplays. In fact, I was trying to do screenplays for a little bit of time, and then I just thought there's so much external validation you need. Like you need so many people to say yes in order to
Hmm.
get something made in that world. Whereas with a novel, I can just be like, once upon a time, and I'm off to the races.
Yeah.
And so that was really kind of the selling point was just like, let's just, put aside all of this needing permission from anybody else and just do the thing that I want to do and see where that takes me. And then, as I said, I think I was going through sort of this, professional slash emotional crisis around the time that I had this idea. And I thought maybe it's now or never, and maybe I should see if I can actually write this thing because I've got an idea that every time I come back to it, even if I don't do anything with it for, several years, which is what happened, I still thought that's a book that I want to read. And so I've got to write it.
Tell me a little bit more about that, about the starting and stopping. What was going on in your life while that was happening? What what initiated the first novel? What made you put it down and pick it back up?
There are academics who are able to do everything. I know them. I know they exist. There's people who can teach all day and then publish and also write fiction or poetry. And somehow, and they're raising kids. I don't know how on earth they do it because I don't have that kind of mental bandwidth. So I found, I thought, okay, I'm still teaching philosophy, and on the side, I'm gonna start this book. And I got so little done on the book while I was teaching philosophy. I just found that um, the job itself and the mental taxation of that job, I just didn't have any energy or inspiration left to work on
Hmm.
fiction. So I thought I need something that is fairly mindless to do to make money, and then I'll reserve my kind of mental energy for this book. So it took a while to extricate myself from, this one paying gig to another that was, that left me a little bit more mental energy.
I'm curious, what was the thing that left you more mental energy?
It was editing scholarly work.
Okay.
So I was a copy editor, just freelance, but mostly working for some Canadian university presses.
Yeah.
And in the time that I was writing this book, I edited about 50 books for mostly historians, it seemed, was my beat. I don't know why, but a
Hmm.
lot of Canadian history, which actually proved kind of useful while I was writing because I could crib little bits and pieces of information and just stick it into the other valley. So, for example, the other valley, I don't think we've talked about this yet. It takes place, as you said, in a kind of an otherworldly setting. But the setting is largely French. A lot of so we've talked about, I guess, like the Conseil you've already maybe put together. There's French naming conventions and Odile, a French name. And that was inspired by a book I was editing at the time, which was about the cartography of Paris. So I just started to enjoy, in a previous draft, the book had referred to the council. And then I saw Conseil and I was like, well, that's kind of nice. Let's try
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
And names like Edme, those were just taken directly from this book as well. So in some ways, I kind of miss copy editing because it was this very like rich source of things to steal.
Influences, not stealing.
Call them what you will.
Yeah. Were there any other authors you were looking to um, as you were thinking about writing your own work, or any authors that triggered a response that showed up in the book itself?
Ted Chiang, I suppose, the short story science fiction writer, was somebody else who he's just so good at taking reality, twisting it in one small way, and then following through to the end of the implications. And that was sort of an ethos that I also bore with the other valley. I just wanted to say, if the world was otherwise pretty much like our world, but with this one change where geography represents time,
Hmm.
how could I tell a realistic story within that environment? Because that was always the idea, was to sort of be as realist as I could within a surreal setting.
Right.
I think other people like Jenny Erpenbeck, somebody whose voice I love to read. Yeah, I mean, lots of people.
Sure.
Um, yeah.
This is your first book, and it has won you some acclaim. You were longlisted for CBC Canada Reads, which is exciting. But even more exciting, You won the Kobo Emerging Writers Prize for literary fiction. And when we think of this book and how it sort of speaks to how our past selves brought us to where we are now, um, are there any other things in your past that you feel kind of nudged you towards now being an award-winning novelist?
I don't know about nudging me towards being an award-winning novelist.
Okay, we'll take the novelist part first.
I think I mentioned that teacher that I had,
Yeah.
and I still remember something that he wrote on the first short story that I handed in for that class. He gave it back and it said, "Send me a copy of your first novel." And I think that's about as hard of a nudge as you can get at a young age. I regret to say I have not located him, so I haven't yet followed his followed his advice. But I think that that was a pretty good one.
And if you are out there and you remember being the grade seven teacher of Scott Alexander Howard, now is your chance to claim a free book. So reach out to us and we'll put you together. I read that you kept the other valley from any eyes but your wife's for years. As you look back, does that feel like that was an important part of the process to just really keep this as a personal and private thing?
Yes, well, I mean, my wife would probably disagree and say it was also kept from her for many years too. So, yeah, she has the exact opposite temperament that I do, and once she writes something, she always wants to share it and get feedback, and happy to give it, but then in return, I give her nothing. Just like I'm going to keep this close to my vest.
Right.
I think it's just my temperament. I think also that I was trying to do something with what I thought of as a rather narrow bullseye. I was trying to mix genre elements with a sort of high literary style, and I wanted it to be taken seriously as literary fiction. And I didn't think that I could present it to other people until I had sort of created a proof of concept. I wanted people to read a chapter and say, okay, I can see the exact kind of merging of content and genre and style that this is going for. And I can see that it's going to work. And until I had mastered it myself, I thought, I could show somebody a sort of early malformed version and they would say, oh, this is not holding together. So I'm a big believer in what, I think Brian Eno was the one who said that like young ideas are like saplings and they can be easily crushed, with
Hmm.
too much fussing. They need to be protected. So I
Yeah.
kind of cut my hands around the sapling and just protected it from the world for quite a while. And I'm doing the same thing with my next book. And nobody knows much about it. It's just yeah.
And if we were working by strict genre rules, you would be working on, Odile Part Two, like three valleys over. But presumably, um, if we're playing by literary fiction rules, you're now working on a new standalone work of fiction with its own rules and its own world. Um, can you tell us anything about what you're working on now?
Yeah, so this is definitely a standalone work. I don't think I started out thinking that it might be speculative fiction, like a near future thing, and I realized pretty quickly that it had to be about the present.
Mm.
I think The Other Valley was largely a novel about the past and being haunted by its ongoing presence. And the next book is really shaping up to be also about time, but it's about the present haunted by fear of the future. And so it's a story about somebody like an academic you might call a climate doomer. And they suddenly become the guardian of a small child. And there is a documentarian who is trying to make her name, um, making a film about them and their situation, the road that they go down together. But I think thematically speaking, most of us are living in a state of kind of dual consciousness right now, where on one hand, we believe what climate scientists say about our situation and the odds that we're facing and the monumentally difficult tasks that we have if we want to save ourselves. And then on the other hand, we have our personal career ambitions and in my case, artistic aspirations and familial commitments. And all of that is predicated on really a different planet than the one that we're actually on, I think, at this point,
Hmm.
and a different future than the one that we collectively face. And most of us are familiar with the kind of whiplash between those perspectives that we experience. If you think too much about this one, um, it seems to kind of undermine the other and so forth. So this is a novel that's digging into that predicament. It's very much about the present.
Scott, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I've been speaking with Scott Alexander Howard, author of The Other Valley and winner of the 2025 Kobo Emerging Writers Prize for Literary Fiction. Check out all of the winners, the amazing finalists, and the books that we've talked about at kobo.com/emerging writers prize. Subscribe to Kobo in Conversation in your podcast player, and if you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who you just know is already a fan sometime in the future. Kobo in Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj and hosted by me, Michael Tamlin. Thank you for listening.